troupe. They're performing their hit song titled Dream. Please welcome Spencer Badius and Doc Native.
I still fight, oh, just to save my life.
Yo. Daily on my knees, begging for a miracle. I say I talk to God, but it feels like He don't hear me though. This reality is really trying to bring me down. Scream it out loud, but it feels like I don't make a sound. Getting lost on this road, falling in the struggle. Sometimes I feel so alone, trapped under the rubble. But I fight back just to keep the dream alive. And I'll never give in, I'm made to survive.
When I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life. When I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life.
And I'm so wide awake, open to a brighter day. I walk the path of resistance with every step I take. It's the heart of the people that keeps me going strong. And I'm a living testimony to keep holding on. No matter the cost, I'm gonna pay the price. I sacrifice it all, running the race of life. When I reach the end, make sure my story's true. There's beauty in the struggle, it all begins with you.
When I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life. When I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life. And anytime I feel low, I pick myself up from the ground. I'll be rising to the top, never gonna stop, nothing gonna hold me down. So anytime you feel low, just pick yourself up from the ground, and you'll be rising to the top, never gonna stop, nothing gonna hold us down. Whoa. I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to say, when I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life. When I dream I'm wide awake, I still fight, I still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life. Whoa, I still fight, we still fight, I still fight, oh, just to save my life.
Click her name.
Let's go ahead and get started, Emily.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to let you know, this is being recorded. It'll be shared on our YouTube channel later. We're building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal nation, affiliation, job title, organization, whatever you'd like to share. We'd love to hear. And please engage with each other in the chat too. Everyone's going to be muted until the participant reflections portion of the hour. During that segment, you can use the raise my hand icon on Zoom and the host can unmute you, or alternatively, you can provide reflection in the chat. And you'll receive a link to the recording of the presentation by the end of this week. Next slide. Okay, so this activity is jointly provided by United South and Eastern Tribes and Cardia Services. Cardia is an approved provider of nursing continuing professional development by the Montana Nurses Association. We are providing continuing education units today. You can claim them in either nursing, medical, counseling, or social work, or you can also request a certificate of completion. I'm sharing the link in the chat. The link will also be shared when the recording is shared, and I believe you'll be redirected afterwards. That link is also an opportunity for you to give us feedback, even if you aren't interested in credits. And there are no financial relationships within eligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity. Go ahead.
So good afternoon, morning, wherever you're located. I am Bernice Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation, Public Health Program Manager here at USET. I just wanted to welcome all of you, all my relations, all my friends here. How fitting it is that we are doing this today. I wanted to give a shout out to the Fort Peck Sioux and Assiniboine tribe today, leading the tribe would be my sister Diane, who is, and her team. They're doing repatriation work with the Smithsonian Institutes, reviewing collections and submitting claims to our affiliated and associated sacred objects. So just wanted to give a big shout out to them and the some of the council members there in DC. Next slide. You are on Indigenous land. To learn and acknowledge what tribal nation land you are on and your organization are standing on, just go to this website, or you can go ahead and text this number and it'll show you. Next slide. So we are reconnecting our Indigenous community. Thank you for being a part of reclaiming our collective stories. So this data is gathered from the registration data collected from last year. So as you can see, it's each one of those dots represent a collaborative of many people across not just the country, but across the world. As you can see on this map here. Next slide. Next slide. So I would like to introduce Holly Ekuhawk, who will be speaking on Native traditional practices, culture is treatment. The floor is yours, Holly.
Great. Hey, everybody. Good to see all the names, all the tribes, all the states, all the locations. It's fabulous. So if you can just go to the next slide. Well, first, I just want to thank you all for joining the Native Brilliance series. We started this in 2022 in January, a year ago. This is kicking off our 2023 series. So we're continuing on with your support. So thank you for joining us. Next slide. And throughout 2022, we believe and honor the innate intelligence of Native people. We know that our brilliance is too often So I don't see any slides. I see all of you now. My screen. Okay, so the next slide, Brian, thank you. I don't see any slides. Oh, there you go. Okay, so the learning objectives for today. Number one, every session we do, we want to increase our knowledge of the innate intelligence of Native people and how that's related to treatment and lifelong recovery. Today, we're going to focus more on, I'm going to share information with you that will deepen your understanding of how cultural practices serve as healthy behavior teaching tools and how cultural practice influence behavior change. We're going to talk about how culture-centered behavioral health approaches motivate behavior change. And I'm going to share with you at the end how traditional practices, not only how they support healthy behavior, which we're going to talk about throughout this, but how traditional practices correspond to behavioral health services and behavioral health goals. So if you can go to the next slide. So here's the question, it's the so what question, right? Why is healthy behavior important for Native people or for anybody? But in today's, in our session, we're going to focus on Native people. And the next, click one more time, Brian, please. So the answer is because behavioral health, which I often like to call healthy behavior, we use kind of clinical terms like behavioral health, and somebody from my home in Oklahoma, that doesn't really mean a lot to them. But if I flip the words around and talk about healthy behavior, that makes more sense. But healthy behavior is super serious business. And I'll show you a couple of things why. The next slide. So despite our fabulous strengths and the resilience of Native people, there's some serious challenges that are happening now. One is that the Native life expectancy rate has dropped more than 6.5 years in the past few years. And the life expectancy for tribal people, Native people in the US is now 65.2 years, largely driven by the pandemic. But the tribal people in the United States had the largest decline, the biggest drop in life expectancy compared to all other United States racial groups between 2019 and 2021. So that's one reason. Second reason is fatal drug overdose rate continues to be highest for Native people. And obviously we're disproportionately affected compared to other races and ethnicities when it comes to fatal drug overdose. The third thing, which is newer information, is people are starting to look at, and studies are starting to look at the impact of poverty, lack of healthcare access, housing, and discrimination and trauma, and the link to that to wearing down mental and physical health. And this was a study, the source is a study that was looked at the brain aging in Black people, but there's discrimination and trauma is also a Native experience. So it's just a study that for us to think about. So the next slide is just another quick look at the drop in Native life expectancy. So in 2019, the tribal life expectancy in the United States was 71.8 years. In 2 years' time, it dropped to 65.2. So you have to remember that the life expectancy from birth rates are kind of a complicated formula. It doesn't mean it's going to stay at 65.2, and it doesn't mean it's going to continue to drop, nor does it mean you should be afraid if you are almost 65 years old. It just means that in the current formula, based on life expectancy at birth, hugely influenced by the pandemic because we lost so many people. The new formula is for 2021, the tribal life expectancy at birth for tribal people in the United States has dropped to 65.2. That's lower than any other race. I can tell you that in the same study, the Asian American people had the highest life expectancy rate, and I think their rate is something like 83 years old or something like that. So, and all of the races, life expectancy dropped in the US, but the tribal life expectancy had the greatest drop in life expectancy of over 6.6 years, which leaves us at 65.2 years old age at life expectancy at birth in 2021. So not good. So the next slide. This is just a little bit more about the impact of chronic stress due to racism and health inequities. And in that same study that I mentioned before, from what they could see and looking at the brain scans of aging in Black people who have experienced racism and health inequities, that they have a higher risk of developing cognitive disease. So clearly chronic exposure, and I'm really glad that, I'm not glad to see these results, but I'm glad to see the studies that chronic exposure to racism, social, economic disadvantages can lead to accelerated decline in physical health outcomes. And we all know as tribal people that we certainly do have suffered at some point in our lives, and hopefully not too much, but for some people it's a lot, of racism, social, and economic disadvantage. So the next slide. So what's the key? How do you get people, Native people, to be healthier, to have healthier behavior, to make better decisions about their life and their lifestyles? I think the answer to that is, and click one more time, Brian, please, cultural connectedness. I can tell you lots of stories, and you all, in your experience, also have experience and stories about what is the key that kind of unlocks changes in tribal people. Very often it's cultural connectedness. So the next slide. So clearly culture matters. I mean, that's the whole point of our series, and the work that you all do, and the great work you all are doing, and all the communities that you represent. And then and tribal traditions matter. So the next slide, culture matters. So I've thought about this a lot over the years, many years, and have written about it to some degree, about how does culture matter? And with tribal people, in my experience, cultural context has kind of a quiet influence. It's not really obvious, but if you're a tribal person, you get it. It has a quiet but very profound influence on countless aspects of our lives. It influences how we view ourselves as our cultural self, whether we view ourselves positively or negatively as a Native person. I was talking to a good friend of mine not long ago in the Bay Area, a very well-known person who grew up in the Dakotas, and he was telling me that when he was a kid, he used to always, and walking to school, he would always look at his hand and hope that he could not be brown. Of course, he doesn't feel that way now, but as a kid, and because of the discrimination he encountered, that was his kind of a secret wish that he had to himself. So, but how we view ourselves, your cultural context and your social environment is greatly influenced. It also influences how we convey distress. When we're in trauma, when we need help, when we're grieving, how we convey distress is influenced by the culture that we were raised in. The same thing with whether we're comfortable with seeking help or uncomfortable with seeking help. Who we turn to for help. That's kind of a common question in some Native surveys is, who do you turn to when you need help? Most often it's obviously someone you trust. It might be an auntie or an uncle or a grandparent or your parent or maybe a cousin. But culture influences who we turn to for help. It also influences why we decline help. Culture and social environment have great impact on why people choose to decline help. Like, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go through that door. So culture matters in many, many ways. Next slide. So tribal traditions are incredibly important, obviously, but there's behavior expectations around our traditions and ceremonies. Tribal traditions model and often silently attitude, purpose, behavior. In attitude in tribal traditions, it's what they model is respect, reverence, honor. Examples of purpose is often in tribal ceremonies, whether in native language or in English, the person that's leading that ceremony will frequently give a little talk about what that ceremony is about, how it was used, how it's helpful, what the healing purpose is. In our tribal traditions and in our different communities around Indian country, behavior is also modeled. In ceremonies and traditions, and many of you already know this, behavior is appropriate to that setting. It's respectful. You don't hear people talking loud. You hear kind of a reverence, a quietness. You don't see young children running around. Everything is appropriate for that setting. It's a real example of emotional regulation in these ceremonies, and it's modeled silently. The main thing about tribal traditions to me and ceremonies is it reinforces something larger than yourself. You realize that you are part of a community, you're part of a tribe, you're part of a ceremony, you're witnessing history, you're witnessing your ancestral lineage play out in real life. And the next slide. So tribal traditions and ceremonies and beliefs and values have a tremendous influence on recovery from substance use, whether it's alcohol or opiates or whatever it might be. And you all have probably seen this in your work. Returning to traditional practices, or if you don't, if you missed it in your upbringing or weren't exposed to traditional practices, it's a huge motivator for sustaining recovery. And one of the presentations we did, or had the great pleasure of listening to our friend Don Coyas in August 2022, he, and the next month, his daughter, Kateri Coyas, in September, they talked about the Wellbriety movement and the healing forest model. And it really provides some great examples of how important tribal values and beliefs and traditions are in recovery. Now, when you all receive the registration for this series, we include a list of last year's series by month. You can click on those and review those presentations again. So you can go back and look at August or September last year if you want to hear more from Don Coyas and Kateri Coyas talking about the Wellbriety movement. Go to the next slide. So my point is, culture is a huge behavioral asset, a huge behavioral health asset, a huge asset in helping people change their behavior to healthy behavior. And it's everywhere. These tribal assets are everywhere. So the next slide. So here it is in Alaska, a wonderful Alaska Native folks. And this was last year where they were celebrating 10,000 years of cultural survival. The next slide is just some examples that it's everywhere. Our friends of United American Indians of New England in Plymouth, Thanksgiving Day, what conventional is called Thanksgiving Day, what they are referring to as National Day of Mourning. But the great pride that they're there every year, every year in November. The next slide is, our great asset of Gathering of Nations in Albuquerque. I show this picture to some people and say it looks like it's back in 1865 or something, but oh no, that's the Gathering of Nations, current, and it's fabulous. Let's see, the next slide is one of my favorite pictures. I love this one. New York City. The New York Indian Council took this old picture of Lenape people and superimposed it on Manhattan today. But the cultural assets are everywhere in every state, every tribal community. And these are just a few examples of that. So the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous culture as health. This is a new study. It's a literature review actually, that Yamani and Helm. They're in the resource slide I have at the end. I have the reference for it. But they did a literature review of the use of culture in public health, and they view Indigenous culture in their study as supporting cultural ways of knowing and being, cultural ways of being, as a means to achieving health and well-being for future generations. So what they did is they looked at different programs and approaches that use Indigenous culture, and they moved it beyond the cultural adaptation, and they moved it to be further down the continuum of public health practices to actually using culture as health. And the second thing they did is they wanted to include culture as health in addiction and recovery, and wanted to move it beyond just addiction and recovery to broader health, addressing broader health issues like cardiovascular health, and also to include prevention. So it's a new study. It was I think it was published in December 2022. So it's, and I know our good friends at UCLA are using the Yamani and Helm study as kind of the foundation of their tribal provider training that they're going to do for 2023. So you might be interested in looking in that. And I included that also as a reference at the end of this presentation. So the findings of culture as health in their study is when they looked at all of these different Indigenous programs, including US tribes and Native Hawaiians, and I think they might have had some First Nation programs, but they looked at all of them and they found some commonalities. And so their definition of culture as health appears to rely on, in their words, 4 modalities. One is Indigenous way of knowing, Indigenous cultural practices, place-based and sacred sites, and Indigenous spirituality. So the Indigenous way of knowing, what the common pieces they saw in that is recognition of the role of elders and cultural practitioners, and the role that they play in knowledge transmission, of taking that ancient knowledge that they have and making sure it's passed down to other generations. And they talk about is how important applying what they call ancestral consciousness is to developing culture-driven interventions. The Indigenous cultural practices, the second one, that too they found it was grounded in intergenerational passing down of knowledge. And the intergenerational transmission of cultural practices perpetuates our epistemologies and our cosmologies. They use a couple of examples there in cultural practices. Well, I had several, but I just picked two for you. One is using native equine therapy for with young people for solvent use prevention. Another one that they highlighted in their study is using for Native Hawaiian people, using the hula as a way to reduce blood pressure in those Native Hawaiian people who have coronary disease. So that's an example of culture as health in terms of practices. In the place-based and sacred sites modality, they refer to it as, they saw that that is incredibly fundamental to the culture as health concept. The sacredness of sites, you know, most tribes that I know have sacred sites, sacred mountains, sacred rivers, sacred sites, but they can also be what they refer to as transitory sacred sites, meaning when certain cultural driven programs are taken to different locations, like Dr. Dan Dickerson and his studies and that he's done with the healing power of drumming, when they take that program to introduce it in other communities, the space that that occurs in becomes a sacred site. So that's what they mean by the transitory, that some are place-based, like a sacred mountain. Some become sacred, that space becomes sacred when you take a cultural program in to different communities. The last one, indigenous spirituality, that was embedded in every one of the interventions and programs that they looked at. And of course, we all know that that includes sometimes organized religion. Most often it's more spirituality. Prayer is part of ceremonies and almost always part of cultural events. But they think that the culture as health has all four of those modalities. So the next slide I want to show you is an example of all four of those modalities. So I just jumped right into this. I didn't introduce myself, but I am a member of the Pawnee Nation in Oklahoma. I was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma. I was raised in Pawnee, Oklahoma. And my mother was a Pawnee Nation member. My father was Pawnee. So I have deep genetic codes about the Pawnee Nation in me. So the Pawnee people used to live in earth lodges. And when we were up before Oklahoma was Indian country and they moved tribes down into the state of Oklahoma, we used to be up in the Dakotas and Nebraska. And where we lived was in earth lodges. And there's now like maybe 2,000 Pawnee Nation members, but you know, at one time in the past, there was probably more than 10,000. So there were villages of earth lodges. And they're pretty spectacular, actually. And there's one still in Nebraska. It's kind of part of a museum. So if you ever get to northern Genoa, Nebraska, northern Nebraska, you can see a Pawnee Earth Lodge there. But in Pawnee, Oklahoma, we recently built an Earth Lodge on our tribal land. So this is an aerial view of it as it was being built. And you see where the dirt is kind of at the bottom of the photo. That's the entrance. And it's round, and there's the trees are like the rafters, what people would call rafters. And it was really important. And the Pawnees and the Arikaras we're close and our languages are close, similar. And so some Arikara people came down to Pawnee, and together they built this Earth Lodge. So the next picture is the interior of it. So you can see how it's put together. What you can't, if you look behind the fire, there's seating in the dirt all the way around the circle, which could be beds back in the old days. And this was just finished recently. I was just there. This is 2 months ago. Well, this is November, Veterans Day. So I went home to Oklahoma for the Veterans Day dance, which is a war dance, which is really wonderful. But one of my nephews received his Indian name. And so we had that ceremony occurred in the Earth Lodge. It was the first time that this particular Pawnee Earth Lodge was used for a naming ceremony. So my family was all there, my nephew, the Pawnee people who gave him his name. But I just want to share this picture with you because it combines all of the culture as health, the 4 modalities of culture as health. Indigenous way of knowing, they talked about, to my nephew, who lives in Alaska, and so they welcomed him as a tribal member. They talked about some history of Pawnee Nation. They talked about the Earth Lodge. They talked about the naming, the meaning of having a Pawnee name. And so there was a lot to it. It was very similar to this picture. There was a fire. So they combined the Indigenous way of knowing, the Pawnee way of knowing. They combined cultural practices. It was a place-based sacred site, and it was Indigenous spirituality. The other thing that they did after they gave my nephew his name, they talked about one of the things that the Pawnee tribe, like, many tribes are bringing back different aspects that were always part of our tribes, but maybe not as common anymore. One of the things that the Pawnees are bringing back is the camp crier. So back in the days before there was any white people, and it was only Native people in the country, in our villages, we had a camp crier, and the camp crier would go around early in the morning and was literally, would be telling people to wake up, that it's going to be a good day. And so we had a camp crier. Well, we brought the camp crier back, and so the camp crier was there with us in the Earth Lodge when my nephew got his name, and he explained his role as a camp crier. And after my nephew got his name, he said, now I'm going to go outside. This is part of the spirituality and part of our cultural practices. He said, I'm going to go and I'm going to let the great spirit know that you're here, that we have another young Pawnee with a Pawnee name. And he went outside and he yelled in Pawnee language that really loud. He went to the 4 directions and repeated that we have a new Pawnee member with a Pawnee name, and did it in 4 directions. And it was incredibly powerful to hear that. But I want to share that with you because and you all in your tribes that you represent have similar, well, maybe not exactly, but some cultural beliefs that you can see that culture is health, the Indigenous way of knowing, cultural practices, place-based and sacred sites, and Indigenous spirituality are all combined and all essential. So the next slide I want to show you is about a reminder that culture is in fact a practice-based evidence. Probably 20 years ago, there was a group of us in the country that worked in trying to promote an opposite to evidence-based practice. My friend Terry Cross was part of that, and myself, and there was some others, and we did a lot of advocacy work around a counterpart to evidence-based practice. And we all know that evidence-based practices are not necessarily norm for the vast majority on tribal people. So we took the initials evidence-based practice, EBP, and we flipped the initials around and turned it into practice-based evidence. So we started this effort on, which I think was somewhat successful in helping the science world, the non-native science world, understand that there is an equally important, if not sometimes more important, approach to evidence. And that's what we called in those advocacy days as practice-based evidence. So if you're practicing, if you're culture driven, you are very knowledgeable about cultural help seeking. You always look at cultural context of whatever the strength and problem identification is in behavioral health. You always look for culturally informed processes for therapeutic interventions. You have to be able to explain therapeutic interventions to the tribal native person that you're working with. You have to constantly recognize the value of the cultural self to wellness and recovery. And you have to be able to have both knowledge of and comfort in engaging cultural resources as a partner to healing. So we have a longer list, but I just want to share that with you, and that just a reminder that culture is a practice-based evidence, and practice-based evidence focuses on the value of lived experience, lived native experience, and the native worldview perspective. So I just want to share that with you. And also the next slide is that there's always growing support for culture-based practices. It sort of ebbs and flows within the SAMHSA, but there's growing support, and I think there's growing support and recognition and respect for culture-driven practices, because mainstream practices don't necessarily work. And so, you know, the key to unlock that door to behavior change is very often has to be culturally recognizable, culturally safe, culturally respectful. So I just want to share this because in the current tribal opiate response grant application, they include in the application language the evidence-based practices, but they also have this in there that says that they're recognizing, of course, that just what I said, evidence-based practices are not developed for all populations or all settings. And if a grantee for the TOR grant doesn't feel comfortable with it, using an evidence-based practice, but they have culturally promising practices or cultural practices that can be used, that in the actual language in this notice of funding opportunities, it says that these culture-based practices can be implemented in the delivery of services. So in other words, they're not forcing people to only use evidence-based practices. So there's always growing support, and we continue to fight the good fight and continue to advocate for the power of culture-based practices. So just wanted to share that with you. And the next slide is, oh, I better speed up. Culture as healthy behavior teaching tools. So like I told you before, or mentioned, a lot of behavior modeling that happens in tribal communities is through silence. It's teachable moments that occur within cultural settings or within ceremonies or within different settings, and behavior is modeled. There's a great resource, I think, that I want to share with you that I also included in the references about. It's titled "Through Silence We Speak." And I was so drawn to the title of that. It's a First Nations approach to a description of behavioral health treatment with First Nation people. But I love the title, "Through Silence We Speak." There's a lot of communication and modeling of healthy behavior through storytelling, through humor, through drumming, through dance, through movement. So let's go on to the next slide. I'm trying to make sure I get to a certain point here. The picture before was drumming in Washington, D.C., a group of men, Native men, modeling appropriate behavior with each other, being peer support to each other. Cultural practices are also super important in addressing grief and loss and unresolved grief and loss. We all have our practices and beliefs in what happens and when there's a loss in our family or in our tribe. Communities come together. Ceremonies and rituals are real stable touchstones. When you're in the most temporary traumatized state of losing someone that's really important to you, that ceremony, the songs, the rituals that we all do in different ways when we lose somebody, when someone has crossed over, those are our stable touchstones. Those can provide cultural reassurance and life reassurance, actually, for people that are grieving. So the next slide. So you all represent, probably every one of you that's listening, tribal programs that use culture in some capacity as part of healing. But I want to give one example of not even a US or First Nations, Nicaragua. Okay, so the Mesquite people in Nicaragua, indigenous people, there was a interview of a Mesquite woman who was a traditional indigenous person, but she also happened to be a medical doctor. And she talked about how they combine conventional Western medicine with the traditional healing practices of the indigenous people and why they need both, and how to develop an intercultural relationship with both, because they each heal different things. And one of the things that they did, I want to mention to you, is that from the indigenous healing, they made, they didn't call it a list, but I'll call it a list. They made a list of all their traditional healing practices, but what they focused on is what was the purpose of that particular healing ceremony or healing approach. Because every one of their, every practice, healing practice, had a particular purpose. They weren't really generic. They were, and some of our tribes, it's the same thing. That some our healing practices were originally designed for certain types of ailments, certain types of imbalances. And so I learned a lot from listening to this indigenous physician in Nicaragua, as she talked about, because she really made me think about trying to really zero in on what is the healing purpose of our practices, and how can they fit, if appropriate, with conventional behavioral health approaches. So I want to show you on the next slide how cultural practices can correspond to behavioral health categories. And I'm going to do this in less than 5 minutes. So the first thing, it's really important to understand what the spectrum of the treatment spectrum is. And this is a real rough graphic, but some practices fit best in engagement, helping people feel comfortable with coming in for support. Sometimes there's pieces that might fit better in assessment, some in recovery, some in treatment. So you kind of have to have an awareness of the spectrum of services and where you might want to best fit, drop in as intercultural support, traditional practices. And then the next slide, and you all will get a copy of all these slides. So I want to share with you how cultural practices and behavioral health practices fit together. And in some cases, some states, some tribes, cultural practices can become a billable service. However, there are many people who feel like that should never happen. Cultural practice should never be connected, linked to a government restraint that might come from billable service. Some people think that that would be validation for their practice and provide financial support for needed services. The bottom line is tribes have control over that. Tribal sovereignty is the end all be all. Tribes decide what they want to do, but I'm going to show you how those linkages can potentially happen. So the next slide, this is the end of it here. So I'm going to go to the next one, please. Okay, so here's some sample behavioral health descriptions, right? Self-esteem development, stress reduction, cognitive and emotional processing. So those are just standard conventional behavioral health descriptions. In the next slide. And then I want to share you an example of Dr. Bigfoot and remind you can go look at her presentation, her and Dr. Schmidt. So this is one example she used in her trauma-focused CBT treatment. And they made this little chart, singing a goodbye song after a family member's passed. The purpose is to have family have a way to say goodbye to the deceased family member, recognize their spirits on the new journey. And then the meaning and fullness and the value is permission to mourn, supportive structure. So you can see how they kind of took it and turned it into this 3-column chart. The next slide. They also talked about cognitive coping examples, leaving bad thoughts at the door, entering a good way, using smudging as an example of thinning away evil and unhelpful thoughts. Next slide. Our friends up in Bethel, Alaska, the YK Health Corporation, they did a really interesting work. And again, you'll get a copy of all this. They took a list of their traditional practices. They listed them first in their native language, and then in parentheses, they put the English. They looked at in the behavioral health spectrum, how that practice fits within, in this case, substance abuse component of outpatient continuing aftercare. And then they wrote a description of, it's not just a tender walk. It could be time to relieve stress. It could be a walk with a counselor. It could help improve interpersonal communication, et cetera, et cetera. The next slide. So this is kind of the steps that they use to do that, which is outlines how they did it. You know, they start with the practice, they describe the purpose, then they described it in another column of in behavioral health terms, the purpose. They crosswalk that with allowable services and state Medicaid plan, and they paid attention to, you know, how that potential practice could be billed as service. Oftentimes it's place and location. The goal is the same as traditional or Western. Okay, the next slide. I only have like 2 more slides, I think. So this is what it looks like in a chart. You can see the different columns. And I think this is helpful. It doesn't have to be for billing. It can just be helpful to help people understand how cultural practices and behavioral health practices can work together and how they actually are doing the same thing. They have the same goal, healthy behavior. And it's helpful for behavioral health staff to see this. It's helpful for traditional people to see that the behavioral health piece. So I just want to share that with you. And I think the next slide is the summation of all this talk. Cultural practices serve as healthy behavior teaching tools, and they can definitely motivate and influence behavior change. And then the last, and then go to the next one, please. So these are the resources I listed for you. The 3 Culture is Health, the Through Silence We Speak, reference the Well Variety movement again. And then the last slide is an upcoming resource you might want to keep your eyes open for. Dr. Bigfoot has a new book coming out called Tell Me a Story. And I loved her dedication. Back up just one real quick. This book is dedicated to everyone we lost because something was broken that did not get healed. And that's where the cultural disconnect often happens, when people are seeking help when they're in distress. So the last one is just thank you so much for your presence today. I'm happy to be here to share this information.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was just amazing. And I just took so many notes in listening to everything you covered from, really looking at the life expectancy to really culture is a huge behavioral health asset, right? There's so many things that you shared. And for a couple of minutes here, we just want to invite all of you to share your reflections and kind of what resonated with you. What are your reflections on everything you heard today? You could put it in the chat box. And if we have just, 1 or 2 comments, I might see if we can get you unmuted if we have time. And just to let you know who I am, I did introduce myself in the chat box. I'm Olivia Davis, and I see myself as a non-native guest in this native space. I am from Denmark and an immigrant to this country.
If you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand and I can unmute you.
We see a lot of appreciation for you, Holly. Folks are taking lots of notes. Oh, we have Mercia. I think we can go with you first.
Hi. So a lot of the folks that I'm working with here are removed from their tribe in North Carolina or just disconnected from culture completely. What are some good ways to either reintroduce or even create some new, I guess, culturally based healing modalities right here in Maryland?
I thought about new East Coast tribes a lot when I put them together, and tribes that are more in the rejuvenation of their connections.
Right.
I think if you look at the resources that are listed and give people an opportunity, it's always about choice, I think.
Right.
You look at the resources, the Wellbriety link, other links that I listed, and get familiar with them yourself if you're not. And then you can figure out ways to introduce them to people that you see, or maybe even in group settings, and then they themselves will choose how they want to play.
No, I've definitely been doing that. So Wellbriety, like we recently just started one here, community run, of course. And definitely been reaching out to other practitioners, healers, to just get input, advice, and guidance. I didn't know if there were just some other recommendations just that everyone would have to continue even my own path and like you said, reconnection. I've been calling it rejuvenation.
Another thing is the cultural connectedness scale. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also a good resource because it has a series of questions in it that helps people think about what they know or what they might want to know.
Right.
I was meeting in Oakland a couple of weeks ago with the cultural, instead of a CEO, they have a cultural officer that's at the CEO level. And I was meeting with him and he said, we were talking about getting people connected. And he said, and it was a really cool quote. He said, if you want to know more, I know how to show you the way. So that's kind of the role that you're in.
Right. And then I guess, what about even getting more?
So Mercia, I'm so sorry, but we have so few minutes left that I'll need to turn it over to our host just to kind of end us on time. I know there's another comment from Erica. Erica, I don't know if you want to put it in the chat box and we can see if we maybe can get back to you. But can I turn it back over to you, Bernice or Brian?
We always have to have time for our closing video as well. So Marcia, thank you for the question.
Brian, next slide.
Thank you all for attending today's Reclaiming series. And don't forget to complete your survey. The link is in the chat box. If you scroll up in the chat box, it also connect you to the survey once you close out a Zoom. So you'll have a pop-up.
We're going to have a great session. We'll have a great session next month on releasing the trauma your body holds.
Not sure what's been going on with our technical difficulties this month.
No sound. You want to tell us who this is, Bernice, while we're waiting on sound?
This is Brooke Simpson. She is a member of a tribal nation in North Carolina, and she was on America's Got Talent. Sorry, I'll play it.
It's that strong kind of love, hold you down kind of love. Rep my city, raising kitties, aging pretty, never drop your crown kind of love. No. I get it from my mama, and she get it from hers. Passing down the mantle, put the flame to the candle of them red bone girls. Springing up in the 252 like a tree that's planted by the water. I know exactly who I am because I am my mother's daughter. Yeah. All day, every day, so tied to my tribe like. All day, every day, Halloween, Halloween. Got my city on my back like a cape, no cap, like a cape, no cap, like a cape. If it weren't for if I wouldn't be when that, wouldn't be when that. Halloween, Halloween. Your whole history is because of me. Indigenous and excellent. Carolina makes them a different way. Heart of gold and melanin. That same strong kind of love, hold you down kind of love. That watch the way you talk to me and my kind of love. Respect is earned, but with me required. Cause your license to loot on my land expired. Springing up in the 252 like a tree that's planted by the water. I know exactly who I am because I am my mother's daughter. All day, every day, so tied to my tribe like. All day, every day, Halloween, Halloween. Got my city on my back like a cape, no cap, like a cape, no cap, like a cape. If it weren't for if I wouldn't be when that, wouldn't be when that. Halloween, Halloween.
Thank you all. And you will receive the recording by the end of the week.
Thank you all. Thanks for sharing the space today. Take care.
Oh, man. I don't know why my Zoom kept crashing.
Oh, so there's nothing more stressful than when that happens during a live presentation. Oh,
I looked at the screen and at first everybody was frozen. I was like, oh my God, everybody's frozen. What's going on? I was like, oh no.
Well, it worked. It all worked. And there was just a lot of information. I felt like I was kind of racing, but I wanted to try to make sure I had a time set to that one part at the end, but anyway, so, but they get the recording, they get the PowerPoint. I remember, because, you know, Livia, we've kind of forgotten lately to put a resource page in, because we used to always have a resource page and we used to put the links to the videos in it.
yeah.
So we want to get back to that. So I'm glad I put a few resources in there. And thanks for cutting off nicely, that lady.
Yeah. Holly, you were so good. It was so good. Just, I know you took a lot of prep and it was so rich. So
Almost
good.
too much.
There's always too much. I was like, she's gonna run out of time. And I yeah.
Well, I'm curious to hear Ken's opinion. I saw that he was on.
Oh, so good. And you did such a good job on the, you know, the article, you know what I mean? And just kind of really laying out the 4 new modalities and how to make it, you know, how to do intercultural practices. You did such a good job.
Oh, good, good. Well, and I'm so glad I thought to use that Pawnee Earth Lodge picture.
Yes, it was
So I sent a
perfect.
picture to my two of my cousins, say, hey, can I get a picture of that? Because I
Yeah.
had the one from the aerial, but I couldn't, it wouldn't copy, but
Yeah.
they didn't know what I was using it for. They don't know what
It
I
came to life beautifully. It was such a perfect
It was a good
example. It's,
graphic.
yeah,
And people like that Camp Crier, which was really profound.
yeah,
Old time,
Mhm.
yeah.
old time stuff. I know that resonated with you, Bernice.
Yeah, it just thinking about bringing, you know, a lot of times you forget some of the old traditional things that that, you know, that you were brought up with,
Mm-hmm.
and then bringing
Yeah.
that back, and a lot of people appreciate that. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, so much information in such a short time,
Mhm.
but our intent is to stir up people's minds, get them thinking about things, maybe think about things a little bit differently than before, and you know, so
But you also gave very practice example of what that could look like, right? So I think, you know what I mean? If we're moving from awareness to kind of skills-based something, right? Or something you can take and apply. I thought you did a great job with that too. So
good. Well, thank you.
yeah, that was fantastic. Setting the bar high there, Holly.
Did you see how many people we had registered, Olivia? You might have
It blew my mind.
we had, well, registered, we had 658 people.
It's just
672. I have no idea how that happened.
72, but we had maybe a couple of hundred on the line, or I didn't look.
178 was the highest I saw, but that doesn't include people that may have dropped off. And I did have a couple people email me saying that they weren't able to get in. So I'm going to research that and figure out why they weren't able to get in.
Did Dr. Kendall ever get in?
She didn't email me. So I'm assuming she did.
I emailed you with her email address.
Yeah, I haven't gotten any. I didn't.
Anyway, we'll have to fix that.
yeah. So, but yep, that was so good.
Well, good. I'm glad, you know, when you're doing it, you can't really
No, it was so good.
tell. And you're just talking to yourself, right?
Yeah.
And when your computer went down, when the PowerPoint disappeared, Brian, then I just saw all the people. Well, not all of them, but a page of the people.
The Brady Bunch. She saw the Brady Bunch.
I saw the Brady Bunch. You know, when that one tribal guy attend, he's so faithful. What's his name?
Chief Burnell.
Yeah,
Oh,
Chief Burnell.
Mhm.
He's not missed the one.
Nope, he's always there. It's true. Yeah.
The other person that was on was Cassandra
Yep.
Allen, and Cassandra is Indian Health Service. in Rockville, senior person, so, and she's the one that gave us the piano tip that we're gonna use, the Navajo piano guy next month.
He just had a single come out, his first single, January 20th on Spotify.
And Bernice, that one slide I made about with the red arrow showing the life expectancy drop, I was gonna get rid of that one because I thought that's just, I've already made the point.
Yeah.
But it's one of the test questions.
Oh.
So I thought, oh shoot, I gotta leave it because I don't want to scare people. And then Terry and I had a good talk about it. So, but I had to leave it in because it's one of the test questions.
I thought it was really good. I mean, it didn't give me any type of anxiety like the
Good.
first time we talked about, some of these issues and things. So I thought it was really good.
That's great. You're my anxiety touchstone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. We had a lot of great people on, and I'm looking at your introduction to yourself. Lots of good stuff in the chat and a couple of good resources that we should follow up on.
Yeah.
Gail, somebody has.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
And I don't know if you know Christina Cruz, the screen for balance called Life Circle screen, which I was interested to see. Somebody said, yes, I am interested in learning more. Yeah, so there's a couple of interesting little things that were put in there, kind of going, okay, that's interesting to follow up on, in addition to what you had on your slides.
I wanted to see that too. And I tried to find her name, but it didn't say Dr. Cruz in the participants, so I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
I was going to send her a message, but.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're on.
There was someone else. I'm trying to pull up my chat, which I only have the last part of the chat, but they said. They gave another, Michael Yellowbird.
Oh, yeah. I saw
Okay.
that. Yeah.
In neuro decolonization and culture.
Yeah, he sounds like he'd be an amazing speaker, just on the work he's done. My goodness, he's done a lot of, I was looking up his books, Decolonizing Social Work and Decolonizing the Mind. I'm like, okay, yes.
Yeah, he's pretty well known.
Yeah.
So, well, we did it. Check off another month.
Nicely done.
I do have another thing.
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, I got something from Paige. I know you have to go. I'm sorry.
No, I don't have to go. I'm trying to pack up my room before they throw me out.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to send a reminder that social work information is due next Monday, January 30th.
Oh my gosh. For
March.
For February or March?
For March.
Okay. I'm going back.
I'll send you an email about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to meet. Did we say we're going to meet on Friday to continue our topic discussion?
If you're going to be available, yeah.
Yeah, I'll be back. I'm coming back. I'm going home Thursday night.
Okay. Then yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Bernice?
No, I think we're good.
I like your earrings.
Thank you.
They look great.
Yeah, they do.
They're different. Well, Olivia, thank you as always.
Oh, no, thank you.
I will catch up with you all later then. I'm gonna zipping up here and get out of the room.
Talk soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.